wo es keine Zeugen mehr gibt vom Leben eines Menschen. Einmal, wenn man Lottes Bilder noch bewundert, wird man sich fragen, was war das für ein Mensch, der solche Bilder gemalt hat.
This drawing is probably not what you think it is. Take a moment and look at it. What do you see? My guess is that most people will say they see an older gentleman, possibly asleep. But what if I told you it's not somebody's sleeping grandpa? It's a dying man. Okay, creepy, maybe, but still, someone's relative who's dying and the artist felt compelled to capture the moment. Not unheard of, but that's still not the whole story. What if I further told you that this is a drawing of a dying grandfather, allegedly drawn by the person who murdered him? Ah, there we go. Shock? Horror? What the F? During this video, I'm going to tell you the story of the artist who created this drawing of her dying grandfather after she claims to have poisoned his omelet. And the thing about this tale is that this moment, captured in pen and ink, is only one of the worst parts of this story. The artist is Charlotte Salomon, and her story is told in a series of artworks she created detailing specific moments in her life, mostly in gouache. Now, we're not talking 100 or even 500 artworks. It's actually more like almost 1,300, of which she hand-selected almost 800 for the final piece. And these paintings, they didn't even see the light of day for almost 2 decades after her death, because she, a German Jewish woman, left them in the care of a confidant, secretly. And when they were delivered to her family was so shocked by what was contained within that they chose to keep her secrets long after her death. Who was Charlotte Salomon? What do her artworks tell us? And what compelled her to allegedly kill her grandfather and watch him die while she sat beside him and drew his portrait? Let's find out. By the way, I'm Jaime Leigh, and this is Jaime Leigh Art. Here on my channel, I talk about stories about art and true crime or paranormal art. I teach you how to create art using a light box, and I do other art related things like time-lapse painting videos and art tutorials. If any of that sounds like your thing, I would love it if you'd like this video, subscribe, and or ring the bell to be notified of new videos. Now, let's talk about Lottie. Charlotte Salomon's parents met during World War I. Her mother, Franziska Grunwald, was a nurse on the front lines, and her father, Albert, was a surgeon/physician. He was actually the first physician to study x-rays of breast tissue, and is often called a founding father of mammography. The family was fairly wealthy and settled in Berlin, Germany, in the Charlottenburg suburb, a borough of Berlin where well-to-do families of the time often settled. Charlotte was Albert and Franziska's only child, and she entered the world with an already strange type of burden to bear. Despite her father's objections, Charlotte's mother named her daughter, born on April 16, 1917, after her own sister, Charlotte. Her own sister who had been dead for 4 years, which isn't uncommon. Lots of people honor relatives who have passed on by naming children after them. It's the way in which Franziska's sister died that made it eerie. At age 18, Charlotte Grunwald left her wealthy, cultured family's home one November night in 1913 and walked 21 miles in the cold and dark to drown herself in Lake Schlachtensee. Despite the early weight of her name, Charlotte's early childhood was one of comfort and the trappings of the wealthy. Holidays were memorable and filled with the traditional celebrations like Christmas trees and toys. There were also vacations to places like the Bavarian Alps and Italy. Charlotte was an outdoorsy girl who excelled at ice skating and loved outdoor sports. But beneath the thin veneer of parties, toys, vacations, and privilege, her family had many dark secrets. Mental illness, nervous breakdowns, molestations, suicides, drug overdoses, and Freudian love triangles going back generations. When Charlotte was 8, her mother's mental health deteriorated rapidly, and Franziska became increasingly obsessed with death. Salomon, called Lottie by most, and her mother frequently visited her aunt Charlotte's tomb, as Lottie's mother mourned her sister still. Lottie's mother's demons were creeping in slowly, and nobody was really in a place to help her deal with them. Lottie was just a small child, and her father Albert was often working. According to a book written about Charlotte, this time in her childhood was challenging. Quote, "Her mother shuts herself up for weeks at a time. Then, suddenly, the social demon possesses her. Charlotte enjoys these transformations. She prefers anything to apathy. A deluge is better than a drought. But the drought returns now, and the rain of life ceases as abruptly as it started. And once again, Franziska lies in bed, exhausted by nothing, lost in contemplation of some other world at the far end of her room." Unquote. Death seemed more and more attractive to Franziska. She told her daughter, quote, "In heaven, everything is much more beautiful than here on earth." Unquote. In February of 1926, Franziska went to stay with her parents to try and deal with her opium addiction and the aftermath of a possible overdose. It was here that Franziska sadly died. Little Lottie was told that her mother had died from influenza. And it wasn't until many years later, when Charlotte was an adult, that she learned the far darker truth about her mother's death. Franz had succumbed to her family's dark legacy and followed in her sister Charlotte's footsteps, so to speak. She took her own life by throwing herself out of a window in her parents' home. Lottie didn't learn the true cause of her mother's death for 13 more years. Later, when Charlotte began creating her life's work, the gouache paintings that would make up her life or theater collection, she dedicated one page to her mother's passing. It features a series of vignettes on one page. Charlotte and her mother in bed, her mother ascending to heaven, a host of people in heaven looking down on the scenes below, and a depiction of Charlotte's mother leaving a letter at Charlotte's window. Charlotte's mother had promised to send Charlotte correspondence from the celestial spheres, and Charlotte checked over and over again to see if there was a letter at her window. But much to her disappointment, there was nothing. Her mother's full quote to Charlotte before she passed was, quote, "In heaven, everything is much more beautiful than here on earth. And when your mommy has turned into a little angel, she'll come down and bring her little lambkin. She'll bring a letter telling her what it's like in heaven, what it's like up there in heaven." Unquote. That was Charlotte's mother's promise. The text for the page that Charlotte painted reads, "She was very disappointed." In 1930, 4 years after Franziska's death, Lottie's father married well-known contralto singer Paula Lindbergh, and for a long time, Lottie and her new stepmother were very close. In her artworks, Charlotte nicknamed Paula Paulinka Bim Bam.
Warum heißen Sie in diesen Bildern Paulinka Bim Bam?
Ja, das ganze Werk hat sie ja wohl etwas anonym machen wollen. Hat sie von der Musik aus wahrscheinlich diesen Namen.
Paula and Albert's status during these years was high, and the family rubbed shoulders with well-known names like Albert, Einstein, and Schweitzer. Then, in January of 1933, the life the Salomons knew would change forever. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Albert lost his job at the university and began a job at the Jewish hospital in Berlin. Paula's singing engagements around the capitals of Europe were canceled, and she began singing for the newly formed Jewish Cultural Association, the Kulturbund. In September, Charlotte, who was 16, refused to return to school and began to study art on her own, begging her father to let her have a tutor, which he eventually did. Lottie had been attending the Fürsten Bismarck School for Girls, but she hated the school's new Nazi educational regulations. The school was directed to promote racial purity and exclude Jewish students, and Lottie would not stand for that sort of treatment, so she dropped out. She represented her thoughts on Nazi symbols in one of her artworks, later on a page covered with backward swastikas, because Nazi symbols offended her. At this time period in Germany, German universities restricted their Jewish student quota to 1.5% of the student body, and those students had to prove that their fathers had served in the front line in the First World War. Despite these tight restrictions, in 1936, an instructor named Ludwig Bartning helped Leigh get accepted into the United States Schools for Pure and Applied Arts, or in German, this right here, because he recognized her talent as an artist. The school itself provided reason why they agreed to admit Charlotte as one of their 1.5%. Basically, she posed no threat. Officially, according to the admissions committee's notes, she was deemed to be so modest and reserved, and they stated she would not present a danger to the Aryan male students. When some of Salomon's classmates were interviewed, they recalled her as having no definite characteristics and being uncommonly inarticulate, like a non-person, which, if you've been paying any attention up until now, is obviously complete bullshit. However, maybe this description was important to make Charlotte appear as unthreatening a student as possible. Still, Charlotte studied painting there for 2 years and was by all accounts a brilliant student. She focused on learning painting and ate up books about Marc Chagall, Matisse, and Edvard Munch from the library, which was lucky, since many books had been banned and removed by that point. She also attended the Kulturbund's many outstanding performances for Jewish audiences, where she learned to see art as a source of morale and a means of self-expression when little was allowed. In the background, during the time Leigh attended school, things were becoming more dangerous and more regulated for Jewish citizens. In 1937, the Nazis organized the famous Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich, emphasizing with great fanfare their attack on modern artists. There's no record that Leigh attended the exhibition, but it is likely that she knew about it, and it may have weighed heavily on her mind. It was in the mix of all this strange brew of fear and uncertainty that Leigh did allegedly have one bright spot. Paula Lindbergh Salomon, Lottie's stepmother, hired Alfred Wolfson as her own voice coach, and he became very integrated with the Salomon family for a time. Despite his being 21 years older, he became the focus of Lottie's heart. Around the years of 1937 to 1938, Alfred allegedly became Lottie's mentor and first lover. Yet, in a weird admission in her artwork about him, Leigh disclosed that he was in love with her stepmother, referring to her as his Madonna. In Life or Theater, Leigh gave Alfred Wolfson the name Amadeus Dauberlon, or Penniless Mozart. By all accounts, he was something of a ladies' man, and his entrance into her artwork is marked with the Toreador song from Carmen. So, who was this man whose face Charlotte painted in her artwork 2,997 times? Wolfson's adult life was defined by what he had endured at age 23 in World War I. He was a soldier in the war and had been left for dead in a trench, buried among the dead and the dying. This trauma left him unable to sing. After the war, he became a voice teacher with radical theories that emotional healing could produce an expanded octave range. Leigh clearly adored him, but also poked fun of him in Life or Theater. Over the 2 years of their supposed affair, it has never been confirmed as an affair by anyone other than Charlotte in the Life or Theater manuscript. Salomon and Wolfson met and put themselves at great risk by meeting in public cafes and on public benches marked for Aryans only, Nur für Arye. She painted the two in her work as in love and quite affectionate, and her written narration of her artwork contains large chunks devoted to Alfred's philosophical thoughts and discussions. As for Alfred himself, he did discuss Lottie in an unpublished 1946 manuscript, The Bridge, where he voices his frustration with their style of interaction. He paints Lottie as taciturn, nearly silent, with him clowning around and filling the silence with an endless torrent of words. The affair, if it was in fact as real as Charlotte painted it, ended abruptly and frighteningly around November of 1938. At this point, Charlotte was no longer at university. At some point in 1938, all of the things working against Lottie in the background came to a head and started a march toward the inevitable. The anti-Semitic policy of Hitler's Third Reich meant that it was too dangerous for her to continue attending the college, even though she had technically won the Academy's annual prize in painting in 1937, a prestigious and blind competition. Her drawing, Death and the Maiden, originally won the Sonnenkohl Prize, with the theme that year being German fairy tales. In a cruel and unfair twist, however, Lottie was not allowed to receive her prize in public because she was Jewish, and instead it was given to a non-Jewish friend of hers named Barbara. For Lottie, this humiliating public denial of her talent was a significant disappointment. The now 21-year-old again decided to drop out of schooling, this time for good. Up until this point, the political and social climate in Berlin for Jewish people had been a slow, steady squeeze of pressure, but the pace was quickly picking up. Jewish people had been stripped of jobs, homes, dignity, and then things would take a violent turn. Charlotte was caught in the middle of all of this, watching the world she knew fall to pieces. Enter the pogrom of November 9th and 10th, 1938, referred to as Kristallnacht. This is when everything changed for the Salomon family. The so-called Kristallnacht was a series of coordinated attacks against Jewish people throughout Nazi Germany and parts of Austria on the 9th and 10th of November in 1938. Kristallnacht, or literally Crystal Night or Night of the Broken Glass, was carried out by SA paramilitary forces and German civilians. The German authorities just looked on without intervening. The name Kristallnacht comes from the shards of broken glass that littered the streets after the windows of Jewish-owned stores, buildings, and synagogues were smashed. A pogrom is a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, particularly the Jewish people. Immediately following Kristallnacht, in November of 1938, Albert Salomon was arrested, incarcerated, and tortured in the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, 21 miles north of Berlin. He lost half his body weight before his wife, Paula, was able to acquire forged papers that secured his release. The scared couple then quickly ushered their daughter out of the country. This farewell earns 27 paintings in Life or Theater, 6 of them showing a passionate final meeting between Charlotte and Dauberlohn in his room. Quote, "May you never forget that I believe in you," he says, unquote. Charlotte's father Albert was safe and alive, but forever changed. And Paula and Albert decided for safety reasons that Lottie should be sent to stay at her maternal grandparents' home in southern France. This is where we encounter 2 new characters in Charlotte's life and her artworks. Her mother's parents were Ludwig Grunwald and Marianne Benda, 2 people who seemed the least likely to watch over an overwhelmed and scared 21-year-old Lottie, as they were by many accounts rather unpleasant people who grumbled and complained frequently. Their names in her Life or Theater manuscript were Mr. and Mrs. Narr, meaning the groaners, or scratchy or prickly. So, arriving in Villefranche in January of 1939, Lottie found her grandmother deeply depressed. Her grandparents were living with Audelie Moore, an American heiress, on the outskirts of Nice. Moore's villa, L'Hermitage, was a beautiful large estate with beautiful gardens, waterfalls, and views of the Mediterranean. It was an asylum for many orphans and exiles of Nazi Germany. The villa was located on the Avenue Coven. Lottie and her grandparents lived in a small house at the back of the extensive gardens. About 2 months after Lottie's arrival in France, her father and stepmother, Albert and Paula, flew out of Berlin on false passports to Amsterdam, where they took refuge. For the time being, at least, everyone was safe. But living with her grandparents was an ordeal for Charlotte. Sometime in late 1939 or early 1940, Lottie and her grandparents had moved out of L'Hermitage to a flat in Nice. It is said that they had some sort of falling out with Audelie Moore. The grandparents did. And so they got their own place and they took Charlotte with them. And this apartment is where Charlotte's grandmother tried to hang herself, but she was discovered before she was able to succeed. Charlotte then took on the difficult burden of watching over her grandmother to ensure that she did not attempt another suicide. In some of Charlotte's paintings, it is as though she is physically putting herself between her grandmother and her grandmother's desire to die. During this turmoil, Ludwig was finally forced to reveal the family's dark secrets to Lottie. In an angry, winding tirade, the truth is spewed at Charlotte. In short, her family was burdened with mental illness and death. She learned of her mother's true fate, as well as the fates of the rest of her family. Over 7 suicides in her family, including her mother and her Aunt Charlotte. Over 3 generations, there had been 2 men and 6 women, and soon to be 1 more. Despite the efforts of Lottie and Ludwig, in 1940, Charlotte's grandmother jumped out of a window of the Nice apartment in a split, unattended second, dying instantly as Lottie watched on in horror. Her grandmother had stockpiled Veronal and morphine for when or if the German army arrived. But when she was denied access to the medication, she instead tried and failed to hang herself, before eventually succeeding by throwing herself out of the window. As you might imagine, all of this affected Charlotte terribly. After what she had witnessed and what her grandfather told her, she began to see herself as the designated heir to this terrible legacy. "Dear God," Charlotte cries out in one of her later paintings, "just let me not go mad." To her parents in Amsterdam, she wrote, quote, "I will create a story so as not to lose my mind," unquote. Now, it was just Charlotte and her grandfather, and things got even worse, if you can believe it. In May of 1940, France's Vichy government imprisoned German nationals as France's enemies. Charlotte and her grandfather fled west on an overcrowded train. Here in the telling of the story in Charlotte's life or theater comes a hint at the last and most possibly secret of secrets. Charlotte and her Grosspapa Ludwig are painted sleeping on the floor of the overcrowded train car. And Charlotte writes, quote, "I'd rather have 10 more nights like this than a single one alone with him," unquote. Combine this with other hints at what her grandfather has said to her, his suggestion that the two share a bed because he is in favor of what is natural. Lottie depicts her disgust at her grandfather's suggestion that they share a bed. She protests that there is nothing natural about it. According to Charlotte's own words, quote, "Everything I did for my grandfather drove blood to my face. I was sick. I was constantly beet red from mute rage and grief," unquote. She also exposed his theater of civilized, cultured man act, calling him an actor and an egotist, a puppet who has never felt true passion for anything. The rage Charlotte aims towards him, the disdain she clearly feels, and the accumulation of tragedy. I mean, 2 daughters and a wife that took their own lives to escape him, paint a very dark picture of abuse, one that Charlotte only hints about in her actual paintings. During a brief stop at a hostel along that same journey, Charlotte asked for a separate room, choosing to shut down the advances of her hostel mate, a German refugee, over whatever her grandfather was hoping would come out of their stay. Grosspapa, indeed. Lottie and her grandfather were probably brought to the concentration camp of Gurs in the Pyrenees, where it said she watched many artists produce works amid wretched conditions, although there is not a written record of her being at Gurs. The camp had no running water, the barracks had no windows or insulation, and the food was rotten. Typhoid and dysentery were everywhere. Happily, Charlotte and her grandfather were released in the summer of 1940 after only a few weeks, likely due to her grandfather's infirm condition. And they were able to return to Villefranche, where they stayed at the home of Audelie Moore again. Charlotte was forced to a turning point. She called it, quote, the question whether to take her own life or undertake something eccentric and mad, unquote. It seems circumstances may have helped push Charlotte in a certain direction. Sometime during their return, Charlotte remarked to her grandfather, "You know, Grandpa, I have a feeling the whole world has to be put together again." Her grandfather's infuriating reply, quote, "Oh, go ahead and kill yourself and put an end to all this babble," unquote. Soon after they returned to Villefranche, Charlotte, unsurprisingly, suffered an intense nervous breakdown. Unable to cope with the information about her family, her increasing anger at her grandfather, and the lingering trauma of her recent internment, she visited Dr. George Morady, a psychologist who had also tried to help Charlotte's grandmother. Dr. Morady had a suggestion. He told Charlotte that she should paint in order to save herself. Lottie was then able to start supporting herself by painting greeting cards and portraits for Audelie Moore. This allowed her to move away from her grandfather in 1941 or 1942 to an inn, Hotel Belle Aurore, where Audelie paid for a room for her to stay in St. John Cap Ferrat for about 18 months. It was here, on the French Riviera, at the age of 24, hiding from Nazism and grappling with the Pandora's box of her family's devastating history, that Charlotte painted a painting of her face. This broke open a floodgate of sorts and started what turned into her magnum opus, an artwork in over 700 scenes created between 1941 and 1942. She named the massive undertaking Leben oder Theater, or Life or Theater, and referred to it as an operetta or a Singspiel, as she designed it with paintings, dialogues, music suggestions, soliloquies, and arranged it into acts and scenes. In its entirety, it told the story of her Berlin Jewish family from World War I up to the day in 1941 when she decided to paint her life rather than take it, then sat down by the Mediterranean, quote, and saw deep into the heart of humankind, unquote. According to Charlotte, quote, "I became my mother, my grandmother," she wrote. "I learned to travel all their paths and became all of them. I knew I had a mission and no power on earth could stop me. My life began when my grandmother decided to take hers. When I found out that my mother's whole family did the same thing, and when I found out that I am the only one surviving, and when I felt the same inclination deep inside me, craving for despair and death," unquote. Here, she painted like a mad woman, sometimes as many as 3 gouaches a day. Marthe Pescher, the owner of the hotel, remembered years later that she would occasionally take Lottie a cup of rutabaga soup, but she could never figure out when Lottie slept. Lottie was always in her room, painting and humming softly to herself, quote, "like one possessed," unquote. Her technique was to paint scenes from her life, many including tracing paper overlays with words and melodies. Out of the approximately 1,300 paintings she made in just those few months, she hand-selected 769 that made up the final work. There were also 340 transparent overlays of text, a narrative of 32,000 words, and multiple suggestions for specific pieces of classical music to be paired with certain scenes. placed side by side, the 10 by 13 inch paintings would reach the length of 3 New York City blocks. She made a playbill introducing the characters, added a narrator, gave her characters invented names: Charlotte Kahn for Charlotte Can Do, Amadeus Dauberlong, Penniless Mozart, Paulinka Bim Bam, etc. Created an imaginary audience and told them this play is set in the period from 1913 to 1940 in Germany, later in Nice. Some might call it the first graphic novel, and many have made the connection between her work and modern graphic novels or even comic books. Charlotte is quoted as saying, "If I can't find any joy in my life or my work, I am going to kill myself." But at the end of Life or Theater, she seemed to realize that the choice had been hers all along, writing in the epilogue, quote, "Everything will be fine. She does not need to kill herself, like her ancestors, because one must be dead in order to love life even more." And with dream-awakened eyes, she saw all the beauty around her, saw the sea, felt the sun, and knew she had to vanish for a while from the human surface and make every sacrifice in order to create her world anew out of the depths. And from that came Life or Theater. In one of her later paintings, she captioned it, "I will live for them all." Sadly, Charlotte had no idea the further horrors that life had planned for her. After her work was complete, Lottie went back to live at L'Hermitage, but the experience was very different this time. Audelie Moore had fled France in the fall of 1941, taking at least 6, some reports say up to 9, children with her, including 2 babies who swung in cradles from the roof inside her car, and a goat, to sell for gasoline along the road to Portugal, where she boarded a ship to New York. She left L'Hermitage and 4 remaining children in the care of one of her lovers, a man named Alexander Nagler, either a Jewish Romanian refugee or an Austrian Jewish refugee. I've seen it referenced both ways in different articles. For a brief time, Charlotte and Alexander Nagler were encamped at L'Hermitage together and possibly fell in love, or at the very least struck up a relationship of convenience. Charlotte's grandfather, Ludwig, was still in Nice, so she often went to visit him as his caretaker. Not so much out of care, but more like out of duty and also safety, because her being kept safe away from the Nazis really kind of depended on her being the caretaker of her grandfather. But the man was harder and harder to be with, distressed by his life and the whole situation. These visits were hard for Charlotte, having to sit there with her one remaining close relative whom she disliked and distrusted, who possibly essayed her mother, her aunt. Well, let's just say she was not cherishing the time they spent together. In a lengthy letter that she called her confession, that was written to Alfred Wolfson but never delivered to him, and that was only made public in its entirety in 2015, Charlotte wrote that she poisoned her grandfather during one of these visits in February of 1943. Whether or not her account is completely true is impossible to know, but given her resentment towards him and rumors of his sexual abuse, it lends credibility to her confession. Scholars who have studied Charlotte's life and work remain very up in the air over this supposed confession. Maybe because it wasn't released to the world for more than 70 years after her death, so it was hard to align the two images of Charlotte the artist and Charlotte the murderer. Or, according to many, much of her life or theater is considered fictionalized, not autobiographical. So maybe this was Charlotte's way of taking control on paper of the complex and disturbing relationship she had with her grandfather. In any event, there is no proof other than Charlotte's confession that she was the one that took her grandfather's life. So what happened that day? Here is what is known. Charlotte visited her grandfather in her caretaking capacity as usual. It was February 12th, 1943. She laced his breakfast omelet with the barbiturate Vernal, which it was known that her grandfather and her late grandmother had stockpiled it around the house in case the German army was upon them. So the poison was within reach. He ate the omelet, and then Charlotte sat and watched, painting the text of her confession and completing the pen and ink drawing as she watched him fall into a mortal stupor. There is the evidence of Charlotte's drawing of her grandfather dying, so it does seem pretty clear that Charlotte was there that day. Plus, there's this, quote, "I knew where the poison was," Lottie wrote in her confession. "It is acting as I write. Perhaps he is already dead now. Forgive me," unquote. According to the official death records, Charlotte Salomon's grandfather, Ludwig Grunwald, aged 81, died at 11 o'clock a.m. after collapsing in the street in Nice on 12 February 1943. His French death certificate contains no mention of a suspicious death. Plus, how did Ludwig get from falling into a deathly stupor to wandering the street and collapsing? One possible explanation was that the poison didn't kill him, but made him very ill. Once he came to, he may have went out on the street looking for help, but collapsed and died. The letter could have been written as the old man dozed, and then Charlotte left and Ludwig came to, and then Ludwig recovered enough to go out only to collapse later. And there would be no suspicious circumstances for people to check into, no suspicion of having been poisoned, because he was a frail old 81-year-old man. At any rate, the old man was dead, and Charlotte was relieved, in all senses of the word, to be free of his burden. Whether or not Charlotte's relationship with Alexander Nagler back at L'Hermitage was of convenience or true feelings, the pair got married on June 17, 1943. Nagler was 13 years older than Charlotte, but maybe she was just drawn to older father-like figures? When Charlotte was writing her confession letter, she said of Nagler, quote, "He is just the empty vessel I need to pour my crazy ideas into," unquote. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. They got married at the Nice Town Hall with her psychologist, Dr. Morady, and his wife as their witnesses, and their professions listed as director of a nursery for Alexander and no profession for Charlotte. However, getting legally married was a risky move, and it's unclear why they wanted to go this route at this time, because now there was a public record of 2 Jewish citizens living at L'Hermitage. Plus, they were both registered with the local population bureau. Maybe it was because since up until this point, the Italian zone of France was a sanctuary for refugees from the Nazi regime. Maybe they felt protected. But anti-Semitism in the local area was pretty rampant, and this safe zone had been a needle in the side of Germany for a while. I don't think average people understood at the time how determined the SS was. And Jewish people in the area, probably Charlotte and Alexander included, were being told by others, namely 2 men, a monk and a Jewish banker, who were trying to put together a rescue plan for Jewish refugees, that they should remain near Nice in order to stay safe. The worst possible advice. In September of 1943, Italy surrendered and Germany took the region back. The Nazis focused heavily on their search for Jewish people in this area that they couldn't reach before. One of Germany's best agents, SS Captain Aloy Brunner, was sent to carry out roundup operations there. Maybe Charlotte did feel something ominous looming, because within weeks of her marriage to Alexander, she wrapped her almost 1,700 paintings and transparencies and the confession letter in several brown paper packages, which Nagler marked property of Mrs. Moore. Charlotte had dedicated the work to Ottilie Moore. Charlotte then brought all of this to the one safe person she could think of, Dr. Morady. She brought her entire life's work to his home. Arriving one night while the doctor and his wife were in the middle of dinner, she rang the doorbell, and when he answered, she turned the packages over to him, saying, "Keep these safe. They are my whole life." Soon after, Charlotte dropped off her packages to Dr. Morady. Charlotte and Alexander ran out of time. someone reported the two of them anonymously, and they became one of the 1,800 Jewish people from Nice who were deported by Nazi official Alois Brunner. On September 23, 1943, a truck carrying agents of the Gestapo pulled up to the local pharmacy in Villefranche, asking directions to L'Hermitage. The truck took the 5-minute drive up a steep, winding road to the estate. Agents threw Charlotte into the truck, and Alexander Negler insisted his wife not go alone, so they grabbed him too. They were brought to the Excelsior Hotel in Nice to be registered. Then they were transported by train to the deportation camp of Drancy outside of Paris. Charlotte and Alexander arrived at Drancy on September 27th, and then on October 7th, they were sealed into a cattle car, convoy number 60, with Charlotte Negler, draftswoman, listed as passenger number 660 for the 3-day ride to Auschwitz. Within an hour of arriving at Auschwitz on October 10, 1943, 26-year-old Charlotte was separated from the regular prisoners and immediately sent to the gas chambers where she was killed. She was 5 months pregnant with her and Alexander's baby. Alexander lasted 3 months at Auschwitz, doing forced labor before he died of exhaustion on January 1st, 1944. Albert and Paula, Charlotte's father and stepmother, had been in hiding in Amsterdam after escaping the Westerbork concentration camp, where Albert, at risk of death, had refused to sterilize Jewish women. They had no way of getting information on Charlotte, and only learned about her death after the war was over. In 1947, they traveled to Villefranche to be close to the places their daughter had spent her last happy times.
Herr Professor, wann haben Sie Ihre Tochter zum letzten Mal gesehen?
Es war im Jahre 1939, als ich aus dem Konzentrationskamp zurückkam und wir sie zu ihren Großeltern nach Villefranche schickten.
Als wir uns endlich entschließen konnten, nach Villefranche zu gehen, nachdem wir nach all den Dingen uns etwas erholt hatten, um zu sehen, ob wir noch etwas finden konnten von Lotte. Da sind diese Blätter uns, ich möchte sagen, durch Zufall in die Hände gekommen.
Was war Ihre erste Reaktion, Ihre erste Regung, als Sie diese 1000 Bilder, diese Selbstdarstellung gefunden haben?
Wir waren erstarrt. Wir waren dort überhaupt erstarrt, weil wir ja zum ersten Mal wieder auf diesen Fleck kamen, wo wir Lotte eben verloren hatten. Und wir wähnten sie dort ja sehr sicher.
Dr. Morady had been true to his word and gave Ottilie Moore all of Charlotte's brown paper packages. Albert and Paula were not aware that their daughter had painted anything, much less this extravagant pageant in which they themselves played starring roles. They were very moved and amazed to discover basically a life and a person that they knew nothing about. Charlotte's father and stepmother ordered 5 mahogany boxes to store the unusual heritage in for 10 years, as they did not dare to show it to anyone, aside from one friend, Otto Frank. He had brought them his daughter Anne's diary, asking him if they thought it had any value. In 1961, Charlotte's paintings were exhibited for the first time. In 1963, the first book with 80 reproductions of gouache paintings by Charlotte Salomon was published. According to some reports, Marc Chagall, whom Charlotte was inspired by in her university days, was impressed with Charlotte's work. In 1979, Paula gave Charlotte's paintings to the Jewish Museum at Amsterdam. With only a few exceptions, Salomon's archive, close to 1,700 works, is held at the Jewish Historical Museum. Paula took her job as caretaker of Charlotte's life's work very seriously. She only sought to make it public long after Charlotte's death, and even then she deliberately held back parts of Charlotte's writing, especially the confession to murder. Was this because Paula didn't want Charlotte's memory to be tarnished by this murderous act? Did she fear retaliation by association? Or did she have other more personal reasons for keeping this murder confession to herself. It was said in some of the articles about Charlotte that Paula had forbid Charlotte from seeing her maternal grandparents while she was a child. So perhaps there were other reasons that she chose to keep this secret for the rest of her life. We will probably never know, but in any case, fragments of the missing letter were first made public in the voiceover of a 2011 Dutch documentary by filmmaker Frans Weiss. Salomon's stepmother had shown him the pages in 1975 and allowed him and his associates to even copy the text, but requested that he keep them secret, which he did for decades. One reason the pages were kept hidden for so long was because since Paula was in charge of them, everyone stuck to her wishes, and she lived a long, really long life, dying on April 17, 2000 at the age of 102. After the death of Paula, the people who had transcribed the full confession letter decided to open their transcription of those pages. In 2015, the Parisian publisher, Tripode, released the letter in its entirety for the first time in a new edition of Salomon's complete work, Leben oder Theater, ein Singspiel, Life or Theater, a musical play. Charlotte Salomon's Life or Theater is the largest known artwork made by a Jewish person who died in the Holocaust. However, most people who have represented or worked with Charlotte's magnum opus are quick to say it is not Holocaust art. Apart from a handful of depictions of the Third Reich, Charlotte's work is not about the Holocaust at all, but rather about herself, her family, love, creativity, death, philosophy, music, life. It encompasses all of life, from the moments of sitting at the seaside, looking out over the waves with the sun on your back, to the desperate attempts of a granddaughter to unsuccessfully keep her grandmother from succumbing to the family curse. In short, it is a relatable look at someone's life, the good and the bad, much like our modern reality shows, but that unfolds one frame at a time. Those of us watching know that it's a horror movie, but the subject thinks it's a musical, which makes it all the more unsettling. We will never know what was actually truth and what was fiction, and the only person who held that answer died at the hands of one of the worst genocides in modern history. What we have is an artist's representation of her life, at times funny, relatable, annoying, tragic, and a revelation that sometimes the people we think we know will do the most surprising things when pushed beyond the breaking point. In short, even though it's been over 80 years since her death, Charlotte's story is just like all of our stories, minus the potential murder, of course. So, what do you think? Did Charlotte really murder Ludwig? Or was that her way of dealing with the intense anger at a man who caused such chaos and heartache throughout her life? I hope you enjoyed listening to the story of Charlotte Salomon's life and art. Please leave any thoughts and comments below, like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. My name is Jaime, and I'm so glad you decided to spend part of your day here with me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in my next video real soon. Bye!
Das Leben geliebt?
Sie hat das Leben sehr geliebt und hat es immer wieder von Neuem entdeckt.
Aber man hat das Gefühl bei diesen 1000 Groschen, dass sie wusste, wie wenig Zeit ihr blieb und dass alles nun endlich erhascht gemacht war.
Das ist eben das ungeheuer Tragische an der Sache, dass daraus hervorgeht, wie nah sie den Tod gesehen hatte.